One, so I suggest we start. Welcome, everyone. Looks like we have a good turnout today. I'm so excited about this talk. It's really this seminar. It's really, as I was just saying to the speakers, it's really a part of two seminar series that are sort of concurrent. One is the sort of semi-monthly brown bag series hosted by the Michigan Program in Survey and Data Science, as well as the Joint Program and Survey Methodology. And the other seminar series is Inclusive Research Matters series, which is hosted by ISR's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Working Group in Educational Programs. Welcome. This is, as I said, I'm really excited about today's topic, which is really exploring how response effects in answering survey questions can be mitigated. And I will let Sunghee tell you what response effects are. But the reason this is a relevant topic for our Inclusive Research Matters series is because these effects, which really are a type of measurement error, are concentrated in some ethnic, cultural, racial groups more than others. And so to the extent that there's more measurement error in some groups than others, we have a kind of uneven measurement. We have uneven measurement error. We have three experts. I'm really delighted that they've all agreed to share their research with us. I'll introduce each of them before they speak, but they are Fernanda Alvarado-Leiton, Rachel Davis, and Sunghee Lee. Each speaker has agreed to present their work for about 15 minutes, which should leave us time for questions and answers. So please hold your questions until the end. At this point, let me turn things over to Sunghee, who will set the stage. And then I'll introduce Rachel, who will be our first speaker. Sunghee.
Thank you, Fred. I just started sharing the slides. So Rachel, Fernanda, and we have been working together for the last few years on this issue of a response style. And you will see how that actually matters to inclusive understanding of not just certain groups, but the entire society. So it's a collection of three different studies. Actually, it's more than three studies, but we'll just say there's three different studies. You will see some connectivity across three presentations that you will see today, and also how they are distinctively different from each other. So I will have Rachel go first and kind of talk about the overall issue that we're trying to address today. And because I will be driving the slide, we decided to have a little code signal to us. So both Fernanda and Rachel may do this disco move, and that's signal to me to move to the next slide. So Rachel, here's the next slide that I'll move to.
All right.
And yeah, let me just introduce Rachel Davis. Rachel's an associate professor in the Arnold School of Public Health at the University of South Carolina. She earned her PhD from the Department of Health and Behavior and Health Education, as well as a certificate from the Program and Survey Methodology at the University of Michigan. So welcome back, Rachel, who is actually spending some time here in Ann Arbor on sabbatical. I'll just say that each of the speakers, as Sunghee indicated, has strong interests in the topics they'll be talking about today. So Rachel, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you both for that great introduction, and I'll do my dance move. So these three talks together are addressing a common problem. As many of you know, many social scientists are attempting to measure constructs that are inherently unobservable and often difficult to measure. And we often measure these types of constructs using surveys where we have a statement and some type of rating scale, like the example I'm showing here, this disagree-agree scale. But there's a growing body of research that suggests that different social groups tend to engage in systematically different patterns of responding to these types of rating scales. Oh, sorry. So what I'm referring to here specifically is called response styles. If you don't know this term, it refers to systematic patterns of responding to survey questions regardless of item content. And there are many types of response styles. I have a few examples here. I feel like they are proliferating. And one of the common ones is extreme response style. You may have heard of ERS. That's a systematic tendency to select response scale endpoints. Middle response styles, a systematic tendency to select middle responses on a scale. And Sunghee, we can go, yeah. And to highlight the topic of focus for our seminar today is called Acquiescent Response Style, or ARS. And this is termed a systematic agreement with survey items, regardless of item content or directionality. So just an overall tendency to agree. So why is ARS a problem? I'm actually going to turn it over to Dr. Lee, and she's going to give you a concrete example, a real world example from one of her studies.
All right. So we're going to use measurement of a life satisfaction as an example. So there are many ways to measure life satisfaction. One, we're just using two different ways here. One is based on just one particular item. The other uses 5 different items that measure different aspects of life and satisfaction of it. So one item measure, the question goes something like, please think about your life as a whole. How satisfied are you with it? And the response options are something like not at all satisfied, all the way to completely satisfied. 5-item measure, really well known, Ed Diener's life satisfaction with life scale, uses 5 different statements. And the question goes, please say how much you agree or disagree with the following statements. And you can see the first statement, in most ways, my life is close to ideal, all the way to, if I could live my life again, I would change almost nothing. This 5-item measure uses response options that goes from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And as you all know, this is a Likert scale. So focusing on these 2 measures, I looked at health and retirement study data from 2010. Okay, and I like to kind of look at different racial, ethnic, and also linguistic groups. So I divided the respondents into non-Hispanic whites, Hispanics interviewed in English, and then Hispanics interviewed in Spanish. So let's first look at the 1-item measure. Okay, so among the 3 groups, you can clearly see that non-Hispanic white looks to be most satisfied with life, followed by Hispanics interviewed in English, and then Hispanics interviewed in Spanish. You can see the ranking. But once we move to 5-item measure, now the ranking does not look the same. All of a sudden, Hispanics interviewed in Spanish looks to be most satisfied with life, right? So if 2 measures measure the same thing, we should see the same ranking, but we don't see that. So this is, at this point, you gotta wonder, like, why is this happening? Like, who's most satisfied with life? Like, which ranking should we use? The answer to this is in this Acquiescent Response Style, ARS, which we will spend a lot of time on today. As you recall, the 5-item measure uses the Likert scale, using agreement in the response options. And it is also well known, it is well hypothesized, and it is shown through many studies that Hispanics tend to engage in acquiescent response more so than non-Hispanics. And of course, those interviewed in Spanish probably are quite different than Hispanics interviewed in English in terms of their cultural orientation and other things. So you, in using this 5-item measure, when somebody agrees to those 5 statements, it becomes really difficult whether they are saying agree because they are satisfied with life or just because they want to say they agree. So this is one particular example that you can you might actually see in your own analysis. Okay, Rachel.
Thank you for that example. And yeah, just to jump on that, I mean, I got into this work because I was seeing a lot of acquiescence in my data as a public health researcher, and it was really creating a lot of problems for me. Some of you may know ARS can lead to a lot of different types of error, computing scale scores, especially when you're comparing across social groups or cultural groups, reliability statistics, model fit statistics, and more. But most importantly, ARS threatens scientific knowledge. And importantly, it does this in inequitable ways because the error is not evenly distributed across social groups and also respondents. And so it's really, creating artificial differences that we don't want, of course, as social scientists. And so, many people may ask, like, why do we care about ARS? It's, oftentimes in large population surveys, especially with certain populations, ARS may be small or even non-existent, and really isn't a source of concern. But what we're talking about here is really when you're working with populations with a tendency to acquiesce, it can be quite substantial. And many social scientists, focus on, especially in social service areas and things like that, they're really focused on populations with tendencies to acquiesce. Oh, yeah. So there's a growing body of literature indicating that there are many correlates of ARS, and some of these that are more consistent across studies are that ARS tends to decrease with education, tends to increase with respondent age. In the US specifically, we tend to see higher ARS among Latino and African American respondents compared to non-Latino white respondents. And in global research, we tend to see higher ARS when respondents are from collectivist cultures. Okay, so I'm going to switch to talking about a particular study, and I want to call out particularly thanks to Dr. Conrad, who was a leading voice in this and inspired me actually as a graduate student, as sitting in his class is where I got the idea for this study, and also Dr. Lee, and there are many other collaborators from UM and University of South Carolina and the University of Illinois. So just to give a little background, so many of you know the Latino population comprises approximately 19% of the US population. And there are many studies indicating over time that Latino adults tend to acquiesce more than non-Latino whites. So it's currently unclear whether this is due to differences in socio-demographic characteristics like the ones we just looked at, cultural norms that guide communication norms and social interactions, some combination of these things, or something else that we haven't looked at yet. But again, the most important thing is the ARS can lead to erroneous conclusions about Latino populations, individuals, and also artificially enhance or decrease distinctions when you're comparing across Latino populations and other social groups. So as many of you know, there are many methods for attempting to address ARS after data are collected in the data analysis phase. Sometimes these are possible, sometimes not. But I think it's preferable to reduce the occurrence of ARS at the time of data collection, so you don't have to go through those steps after data collection. And you can feel more confident about the raw responses. So we conducted an experiment in a telephone survey. We had a 2x2 experimental design. We conducted this with a sample of Latino adults who were screened as acquiescent, which I'll tell you about in a minute. And we had two primary research questions that we addressed. So the first one was, using conversational interviewing methods to administer a survey questionnaire yield lower ARS than a standardized interviewing approach. And the second one was, will using unipolar item-specific response scales yield lower ARS than using bipolar disagree-agree scales. So we're on the same page. I'm going to define some terms. Standardized interviewing, many of you are probably familiar with. This is the traditional interviewing approach where interviewers are trained and required to read survey questions exactly as worded. And if a respondent doesn't give an acceptable response, interviewers are supposed to use neutral probes that don't influence those responses. So the general overall goal of SI methods is to hold question wording constant so that any differences in responses you can attribute them to the respondents themselves, hopefully, rather than to differences in question wording. So by contrast, conversational interviewing, interviewers receive a lot of training to provide assistance to respondents. So just like SI, they first read questions exactly as worded, then they judge whether respondents need some type of clarification, with a term, for example, or some kind of help. And then they're allowed to say what they believe is necessary to convey the intended meaning of the question. So the emphasis here is on trained. So these interviewers, they're not just guessing at what they think questions mean. They're receiving training as to the researcher's intent behind each question. And then they're allowed to vary their wording that they use across respondents to convey that meaning. So the goal of CI overall is to standardize respondents' interpretation of each question rather than the question wording itself, as we saw with SI. So just to see an example, briefly, an interviewer might say, read a question. In some situations, it's more important to be compassionate than fair. The respondent is unclear about the term compassionate, and the interviewer gives the whatever it means to you response. So very neutral, but also not very helpful. Interviewers might also just repeat the question or do other neutral things like that. So by contrast, a conversational interviewer would be trained to provide a definition to help explain the word compassionate. And so as you can see, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but there's a much more lengthy definition trying to get the idea across. If the respondent is still confused, the interviewer can then use other wording to try to convey the meaning. Again, try to standardize that meaning. So, you know, why did we think CI would reduce ARS? So one is the interviewers can provide personalized assistance to each respondent. So one respondent might have difficulty with a particular word, another one might have difficulty with response mapping, and interviewers could also potentially convey the importance of providing honest, thoughtful answers. This is particularly important with populations that maybe have less experience participating in surveys or maybe uncomfortable about sharing their opinions. And as this example here from a previous study, we asked Mexican Americans why they thought Mexican Americans might be more likely to agree to survey questions. And this person said, well, I guess the researchers just want to hear the positive. They don't want to hear what we really have to say. So on our other research question, we were looking at disagree, agree response scales. I'm pretty sure you guys are familiar with these, but a response scale ranging either from a disagreement to agreement or vice versa. So they tend to be bipolar. And for our study, we went with the disagree to agree direction because we were looking for more acquiescence to see if our experimental conditions reduced it. Item-specific response scales, as you may know, include response option labels. Instead of agreement, they're intended to match the underlying construct being assessed in each item. So in this example, this is a slightly different version of the question you saw on the prior slide. And they were asking about confidence, and the previous one asked about agreement with a statement about confidence. Whereas here, the response scale is specifically asking you to rate your confidence. So it matches the underlying dimension better. As a result, these scales are often unipolar, just to point out another difference between these two scales. So why did we think that item-specific response scales might reduce ARS with this population? So they don't explicitly ask about agreement compared to disagree-agree scales. They also might be associated with decreased cognitive burden because you don't have to, as a respondent, you don't come up with an answer and then sort of translate it to a disagree-agree dimension. And also, we thought it might be less obvious to people about which end of the scale is positive or negative. So we conducted this survey with almost 900 telephone survey respondents, and we had equal numbers of Mexican American, Cuban American, or Puerto Rican heritage respondents because at the time, those were the three largest heritage groups in the US. We did conduct interviews in Spanish and English, and I'm not going to go into the details, but they basically had, and the eligibility screener had to provide evidence of a threshold level of acquiescence. So the interviewers were all professional bilingual interviewers. Most of them were SI interviewers, 6 were CI interviewers. And since they're professional interviewers, they were all used to already using SI practices. They were located physically in different call centers and unaware of the other protocol. They both received specific training for the study. For the CI training, obviously it was much more intense, focused on teaching the intended meanings of every question on the survey, providing interviewers. We also gave them a binder that contained written definitions for all the questions so they could look at them while they were on the phone. We also talked about how the response scales were supposed to be used. So it wasn't just the terms in the item stem. And then we went through a lot of training and role playing to make sure that they understood our intended meaning of each question and how to use each response scale. So again, we had a 2x2 design where we randomized participants to these 4 groups here. I will note that most more respondents were assigned to the SI condition for several reasons. It required more interviewer training, more monitoring by their supervisors. The interviewers were a little longer, and as a result, we knew ahead of time they were going to be more expensive. So we also obtained audio recordings of the telephone interviews for 616 of the interviews. And we had 2 bilingual research assistants who coded the audio recordings for specific interviewer behaviors that we thought might be associated with acquiescence. And specifically for each administration of the 27 items we used to measure acquiescence. So the survey was primarily about vegetable consumption and content. Our ARS variable, however, was based, okay, I'm short on time. So I thought I had more time, but I will skip it. So yeah, we used a heterogeneous measure of acquiescence. Just to point out, the sample as a whole, as it was designed to be, was older. It was more Spanish speaking and lower education because those were characteristics associated with acquiescence. On the whole, our behavior coding indicated that the interviewers were loyal to the methods in which they had been trained. And, so the main findings were that we found that the conversational interviewing was associated with significantly less ARS than the standardized interviewing approach. We did not see a difference in response scale format, and there was no interaction between interviewing technique and response scale format. So we were able to dig a little deeper into the findings due to our behavior coding. One really interesting thing we found is that in the standardized interview condition on the right, you see this, the normal expected pattern of acquiescence increasing with age, whereas on the left, base of that relationship is attenuated, and you don't see that in the conversational interviewing condition. We found, again, through our behavior coding, that it seemed like the 2 interviewer behaviors that were most effective in reducing ARS were providing definitions when there wasn't explicit evidence of respondent confusion, and also when interviewers helped respondents with response mapping. ARS actually increased when conversational interviewers failed to help with response mapping when there was evidence that was needed. So none of the standardized interviewer behaviors reduced ARS, but ARS did increase when standardized interviewers issued neutral probes in response to evidence that response mapping assistance was needed. Okay, and I think probably in the interest of time, I can go into this later about why we think we found some of the things we found, but I think for now, the take-home message is that it appears so far that conversational interviewing may decrease ARS during data collection, at least with this population, and hopefully thereby reducing the need for post-survey adjustments.
Thank you, Rachel. Okay, so I will be talking about my research for my dissertation, actually. So this is a study that compares negated and polar opposite items, which I will explain in a little bit, to construct balanced scales. So, sorry. So these, can you do it again? So this whole research, it's about multi-item scales. So as Sunghee mentioned before, scales that have more than one item to measure a specific construct. So in this case, again, is the satisfaction with life scale. Now, can you? Okay, oh, sorry. We have two types of scales. So we have unbalanced scales, which I think are the norm. And for these scales, basically all items are worded in the same direction, meaning that agree to any of the items, such as the one in this scale, will signify or would imply agreement or higher level of the construct. So in this case, agreeing with any of these items would imply higher satisfaction with life. In the other case, when we have balanced scales, we have some items for which the wording is in opposite direction than the rest. So agreeing to those items would imply the opposite. So in this case, agreeing to the items in red actually means lower satisfaction in life. Now, keep in mind that the idea of these multi-item scales is usually to create a score to represent the latent construct. The problem with unbalanced scales is that we are not sure when we get the score if high scores come from actual a high score for the latent construct, so high satisfaction with life, or if the respondent is just acquiescing a lot. Now, balanced scales as a proposed solution for ARS have been controversial, and basically for two reasons. The first one is that we have consistently seen reduced reliability indicators for these type of scales. And also we have observed loss of one-dimensionality, again, for these type of scales, which means that when we create a factor analysis model, instead of seeing one dimension as we should expect, for example, for the satisfaction with life scale, we see two factors. Now, an important thing to mention here is that we actually conducted a previous simulation study, and we observed that these good properties, these seemingly good properties of balanced scales, of good reliability and having only one dimension in factor analysis, are actually artifacts of ARS. So they're basically hiding the ARS and not really providing better measurement. So we wanted to examine a little bit more about these reduced reliability and loss of one-dimensionality for balanced scales to see if they were really affecting measurement. Okay, so now there are different ways in which you can create reversed items to construct a balanced scale. So you can create negated items and polar opposite items. So for negated items, a negation particle is introduced into the original statement. So for example, here we introduce the particle not into the statement to create the reversed item. For polar opposite items, we change one of the terms in the original statement by an opposite of it. So in this case, we change the term close by the term far to create the reversed item, basically. Now, there is evidence to support that these two reversal strategies are actually not equivalent. So we know that statements with negations are harder to answer. And also we know that they are associated with non-ARS illogical answers, so people agreeing to items that are oppositely worded. So the whole point of this study was to compare the two strategies in their measurement properties, and also contrast that with unbalanced wordings to see how the measurement properties compared among the three. So basically we had like two research aims or hypotheses. So in the first one, we wanted to compare polar opposites and negated items and see which one yielded better measurement properties. And because of what I just said, we suspected that polar opposites would yield better measurement properties. Now, our second aim was to contrast balanced scales versus unbalanced scales. And because of our previous simulation study, what we expected was that we would have similar measurement properties except for reliability indicators, as I said before, because for unbalanced scales, this usually tends to be overestimated. Okay, so our methodology was a web survey. So we had a questionnaire with various measures of well-being. And we draw samples from 3 online non-probability panels. So we had a non-Hispanic white respondents sample in the US that was interviewed in English. We had a sample of Hispanic respondents in the US that was also interviewed in English, and a sample of Hispanic respondents in Mexico that was interviewed in Spanish. Each of these samples had 1,200 respondents, and they were selected because, as Rachel mentioned before, IRS is culturally patterned, and we know that Hispanic respondents tend to acquiesce more than non-Hispanic respondents. What we did was to embed a wording experiment into our web survey. So we took 4 originally unbalanced scales and then created balanced versions of these scales using the negation and polar opposite strategies, and then basically assigned each respondent to one of these wordings. Now, it's important to mention that this randomization was done independently for each scale. So a respondent could see a scale first with unbalanced wording, and then the next one with balanced wording. The analysis that we use were common analyses for the exploration of multi-item scales. So we use Chromix alpha as an indicator of reliability. For factor structure, we use confirmatory factor analysis, and we looked at model fit of 2 separate models. So one with only one factor indicating the latent construct of interest, and then a model with 2 factors, one indicating the latent construct of interest, and then one indicating ARS. And then finally, for convergent validity, we looked at the Pearson correlations between the scores of the experimental scales and other constructs. So this is just to show a little bit about our participants, and overall, the Hispanic in the US sample was a little bit different than the rest. We had more females in the sample. The respondents were on average younger. We had more people with high school or less education, and they tended to acquiesce a little bit more, which is what we expected. And we know this because we have an ARS agreement count, which was a measure based on basically counting the number of agreements that the respondents provided to a set of items that were outside our experimental scales. And we just count the number of agreements that the respondents provided, and we saw that on average, our Hispanic in the US group tended to acquiesce more than the other 2. Okay, so for the results, I'm going to present the average here of the Chromix alpha across each experimental scale. So, of course, the numbers here don't have any intrinsic value, but it's just to show the tendencies that we saw across the scales. So we saw 2 things. So first, we saw that as we expected, unbalanced scales tended to have higher reliability indicator than balanced scales. And we also saw that for negated and polar opposite scales, we had very similar results. So we didn't see a difference in reliability measured there. For factor structure, again, here I'm presenting the mean of 2 model fit statistics, which are the CFI and the RMCEA. So remember that for CFI, values above 0.95 are considered good fit usually, and for RMCEA, that threshold is below 0.05. So here are 2 things again. We have the 2 models that I mentioned before. So one, the CFA content only, which only included the latent construct, and then content plus ARS, which included both the latent construct and ARS. So the first thing that we can see here is that for balanced scales, the fit for content only was very poor, which increased significantly once we included the ARS factor. And this is good because it seems like the balanced wording is capturing that ARS that we want to measure, and that we otherwise can do that with unbalanced wordings. And again, for the comparison between negated and polar opposite, we saw that for both models, the model fit was similar, and we don't see any differences here. Now, something important to mention here is that although unbalanced wordings provide good model fit statistics, we cannot measure ARS, so we do not know the extent of the problem or if there's ARS when we're using unbalanced scales. As I said before, because we're confounding the ARS and high scores for the Leighton construct. Okay, and then the final result that we looked at was the Pearson correlations with other constructs. Here I am presenting a real example. So we used the social provisions scale, and we looked at the correlations with with the scores of two other scales that measure purpose in life and depression symptoms. And here again, we don't see a clear-cut difference between negated and polar opposite scales. However, we do see a quite big difference between balanced and unbalanced wordings. So here is clear that the balanced scales produce stronger correlations with the Leighton constructs in the direction that we expected them to do. So these we interpret as better convergent validity, as the correlations tend to head towards the right direction and just a little bit stronger. Okay, just to recap then the study, the goal of the study was to compare these two strategies for creating balanced scales and then compare that to unbalanced wordings. And what we saw was that, can you go to the next? Yeah. What we saw was that for our first hypothesis of comparing, or our first aim of comparing these two reversing strategies, we saw that the two versions of balanced scales had similar measurement properties. So we didn't see polar opposites being categorically better than negated scales. And for our aim of comparing balanced scales versus unbalanced scales, we saw that including an ARS factor into the CFA model provided good model fit for balanced scales. So it seems again that loss of one-dimensionality is not bad because it allows us to measure ARS. So this second factor that is emerging is correlated to ARS. And then we saw the convergent validity seemed to be improved for balanced scales, as we saw in stronger correlations with the variables that we used. And finally, as I said before, Cronbach's alpha was higher for unbalanced scales. But of course, as I mentioned also, we know that for unbalanced scales, reliability indicators tend to be overestimated because they're an artifact of ARS. Okay, sorry. And I would just say that the implication of this study is that it seems that there's no difference in how you create balanced scales in the measurement properties that we looked at. However, it's important also to mention that we have important body of literature suggesting that negations are somewhat dangerous to use in questionnaire design. So these, of course, needs to be taken into account when you're designing your questionnaire. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Okay, so I will go next, and you will definitely see how this study is related to Rachel's presentation and also Fernanda's presentation. My part of the presentation focuses on satisfaction with life scale, so response style and the measurement of satisfaction with life scale. You can see the co-authors, lots of people were involved at the various stages of this study. So I thank all of you for being part of the study. Okay, so satisfaction with life scale, this is an actual questionnaire that Health and Retirement Study uses. And I just copied their questionnaire. And you saw it more than once already, but just to reiterate, the 5 items that measure different aspects of a life. And if you look at, if you read each statement, you will see that they all are written in the direction of satisfaction. And again, the response options range from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And the scoring usually is done where the strongly disagree gets a score of 1 and strongly agree gets a score of 7. So the suggested scoring norms, you sum up the scores across 5 items, so sum of the responses. And if the sum is greater than 30, you will be classified as somebody who's extremely satisfied with life. If it's more than 25, but less than 30, satisfied all the way to, if it's 9 or lower, extremely dissatisfied. Or sometimes people like to use mean score, average of these 5 item scores. Issues with satisfaction with life scale as currently measured is 1, all items are written in the positive direction. So all in the satisfaction direction. And as Rachel mentioned, I mentioned, and Fernanda mentioned, because it uses agreement scale, it's subject to response style issues. And it becomes really difficult, as you saw with the example of HRS that I gave earlier, it becomes really difficult to ascertain the true satisfaction apart from the effect of a response style. So when somebody scores high on this particular measure, we don't know whether the person is high on the SWL dimension because they are satisfied with life or because they just like to agree, say they agree on these statements. And another issue is that this satisfaction with life scale is widely used for cross-cultural, cross-national comparisons. I put in, there's like the OECD index, and a lot of places use this scale to compare different groups. And as mentioned before, these response styles also vary by the groups that are actually being compared. So it becomes really difficult. Are we making proper comparisons? Okay, so what am I trying to do in this study is I did a very simple randomized experiment on this satisfaction with life scale. So I created balanced versus unbalanced, which is the status quo. I created a balanced scale off of the existing scale. So we have written 1 or 2 items. We rewrote the direction to the dissatisfaction scale. So we create this balanced scale off of how it is currently measured. And then we randomly split sample to different conditions. And it was the same experiment implemented in 4 different surveys. And these 4 surveys targeted various racial, ethnic, and linguistic groups in the US, and also used very different sampling method and different modes. So we wanted to see whether whatever we see with this experiment holds true in the various subgroup, the various population groups, and also various modes and sampling and such. So experiment, as I said, pretty simple. The unbalanced is a control group. So I didn't do anything to the existing measure. And the balance scale, the 5 items, I have written a couple of items in the different direction. And you will see 4 different studies. The study 1 and 2, or survey 1 and 2, we did this balancing at the scale level. So either people got unbalanced scale or balanced scale with 2 items being reversed. In studies 3 and 4, surveys 3 and 4 that you will see on the next slide, it was item level balancing. So depending on depending on the condition, you may get 0 item written in the opposite direction or 1 or 2 items. Okay, so the 4 surveys that I mentioned, the point here is that they really vary in terms of mode and also in terms of the target group. You can just kind of read through, glance through that, you can see that they're very different. And also the sampling is very different. The sample size, various sample sizes, and how SWL, satisfaction with life, was balanced, and also the sample size associated with that. So in survey 1, which was a web survey targeting Hispanics, 550 people got control condition, And actually, it's 2 items. I'm sorry about that. The 617 people got the balance scale with the 2 items written in the opposite direction. And 100% of the respondents were interviewed in Spanish. And you can also see how the languages vary across different 4 different studies here. And the average age, as you see, looks quite different. And the survey 2 here is actually it comes from the same data that Rachel presented. So it's same data, it's a different experiment that we conducted in the survey. A male, again, the second study was a highly female second survey than the other 3 other surveys. And also education level varied quite a bit. The second survey had a much lower education than the other 3 surveys. So again, just focusing on the survey 2, because we screened in respondents who have a high acquiescent sort of tendency, we captured a lot of females, older folks, and also people with low education. So, okay, so what did I do? But first, I looked at what responses people chose on this satisfaction with life items, regardless of the experimental condition. We just wanted to look at how often people choose acquiescent responses, which is strongly agree, or disacquiescent responses, strongly disagree and disagree. Extreme, which is strongly agree or strongly disagree, or middle responses. So we just wanted to see that. And then we focused on the summary scores of satisfaction with life. So first, using the scoring norm, using the sum of the 5 scores, we classify people from extremely satisfied to extremely dissatisfied. So first we looked at that distribution. And then we also looked at the person extremely satisfied from the first scoring norm. And we also looked at average score, average satisfaction with life score, as a function of education and income, because it is well established people with higher education report higher satisfaction with life, and people who make more money, higher income, report higher satisfaction with life. That's established in literature. So we wanted to see how that holds by different conditions. We also looked at the scale reliability through Cronbach's alpha. And we looked at all this by race, ethnicity, and language groups, and also by experimental conditions, and also by survey. So different racial, ethnic, linguistic groups that you will see, I used label HEN, so Hispanics interviewed in English, HSP, Hispanics interviewed in Spanish, non-Hispanic white, non-Hispanic blacks, Koreans interviewed in English, Koreans interviewed in Korean. So lots of groups here. So the responses chosen on satisfaction with life. So first one right here, strongly agree and agree, would be acquiescent responses. Okay, and you can go down the column, and there are a few groups that definitely stand out. So Hispanics interviewed in Spanish in second survey, 71% of the respondents actually chose acquiescent responses. Okay, and on the second column, or I guess the fifth column, strongly disagree and disagree. That's a disacquiescent responses. You can see there are certain groups that stand out more so than others, but this difference is not as big as what you see with acquiescent responses. And the next column shows extreme responses, people who chose strongly agree or strongly disagree. And again, you see the variation, and you see the Hispanics interviewed in Spanish in survey 2 had a really high extreme response tendency. And the last one is basically neither agree nor disagree. So that's a middle response. And there's also variation right there with Koreans interviewed in Korean scoring the highest in middle response tendency. In the next, I combined all the samples into one just because there's just a lot going on. So I combined all 4 samples into one and looked at the distribution of satisfaction. Again, I used a sum of the scores and classify people into extremely dissatisfied all the way to extremely satisfied categories. And the lighter color that you see on this graph means they're more satisfied. Okay, so, and also compare those groups into the across these 6 racial, ethnic, linguistic groups. Just without considering balance and unbalanced, if you look at this graph, Hispanics interviewed in Spanish stands out as most satisfied group, group that's most satisfied with life. And the Koreans interviewed in Korean looks to be least satisfied with life. And moving to the next part, I divided now by the scale condition. So we looked at unbalanced, again, that's the status quo, and balanced, that's the experiment that these studies used. So looking at the green part, if you look at Hispanics interviewed in Spanish, 39% of the people will be classified as extremely satisfied. Okay, if you combine extremely satisfied and satisfied, it's almost the 70% of people, 70% of Hispanics interviewed in Spanish will be classified people who are satisfied with life. But if you move to balanced scale, it's only 11% of Hispanics interviewed in Spanish classified as extremely satisfied, and then another 30% are satisfied. Okay, so between unbalanced and balanced, you definitely see decrease in extremely satisfied when using balanced scale over unbalanced scale. And you will also notice that the ranking changes a little bit. The ranking does not hold between these 2 scales. And the group that you see the biggest impact on this scale balancing appears to be Hispanics interviewed in Spanish, and also Hispanics interviewed in English to some extent. So depending on which scale, depending on whether you use balanced or unbalanced scale, you may draw completely different conclusions. And next, we're looking at each study separately. So study 1, it only included Hispanics interviewed in Spanish. That was the target population. When using unbalanced scale, 26% of the respondents will be classified as extremely satisfied. If you're using balanced scale, it'll go down to 13%. Okay, so it decreases half. Study 2, if you look at Hispanics interviewed in Spanish, with unbalanced scale, 57% will be classified as extremely satisfied. If you're using balanced scale, it goes down to 9%. Okay, so that slope, it goes down quite a bit. And in the study 2, if you look at Hispanics interviewed in English, there's a downward pattern, but it's not as steep as what you saw with Hispanics interviewed in Spanish. Surveys 3 and 4, because we did item level randomization, there are people who got 0 item balanced, 1 item or 2 item balanced. So we were able to look at 3 different groups rather than balanced versus unbalanced. And again, you see this downward pattern. And in survey 3, it seems like when we have a 2 items balanced, the downward pattern is even steeper than just 1 item balanced. And again, this downward pattern appears to be a little stronger for Hispanics interviewed in Spanish in survey 3 than other groups. Survey 4, if you look at Koreans interviewed in Korean, didn't matter whether you use unbalanced or 1 item balanced or 2 item balanced, was always around 4 to 5%. Koreans interviewed in English, the pattern went out just like you saw in other groups. And in fact, this difference between balanced and unbalanced condition, that difference was significant across all groups except for Koreans interviewed in Korean in the survey 4. Okay, so next, I regressed the satisfaction with life average score as a function of education and income, knowing that people who have a higher education should be more satisfied, and people with higher income should be more satisfied than their counterparts. Okay, and I didn't put, because there are so many groups and so many conditions, I didn't put all the samples here. I just looked at a few. So survey 1, if you look at, and also the education and income especially was not measured the same way. The income categories were not exactly the same across all 4 surveys. And also the distribution was not quite the same. So we couldn't use the same cut point. Same thing with education, especially survey 2 was a lot less educated and had a lot lower income than the other studies. So we used a slightly different cut points in creating education and income categories. So survey 1, under unbalanced scale, people with higher than high school education or versus people with high school or lower education, their life satisfaction with life was not significantly different. Okay, so 0.14 was not significantly different between the two. Again, under unbalanced scale of the survey 1, people who reported income greater than $50,000 reported a higher score, average score, life satisfaction score than people who reported lower than 50. But it was marginally significant. The 0.3 was marginally significant. When we use balanced scale in survey 1, both education and income came out to be significant predictor of life satisfaction in the way that we expected. Okay, and if we move to survey 2, just looking at Hispanics interviewed in Spanish only, under unbalanced scale, which is the status quo, it looks like people with a higher education were actually less satisfied with life. That's a negative 0.35, okay, which does not make sense. And in terms of income, it came out in the right direction that people with higher income appear to be more satisfied. And if you look at the balance scale in survey 2, education was in the right direction, income didn't make a difference. And if you look at survey 4, you can also see that once we start introducing item balancing, the correlates of life satisfaction seems to actually show the expected outcome than using unbalanced scale. So out of all this, what I found to be really troublesome is this part, okay? In survey 2, again, people with a lower education looks to be much happier than people with a higher education, which goes against the literature and also against the conditions when we use balanced scale. And Fernanda already mentioned this Cronbach's alpha. When you're using unbalanced scale, you may actually artificially inflate the reliability, because you may capture both agreement to these items agreement to the items, and also actually being satisfied with the life itself. So you see that clearly here across all groups that you see across all studies, surveys, when using unbalanced scale, Cronbach's alpha look much, much higher than when we use balanced scale. Okay, but again, this is artificial because we saw from the previous slide when, like kind of checking the validity of the measurement, when we were using balancing, item balancing, the results look more in line with the literature in terms of expected relationship with education and income than unbalanced scale. But here, you may be convinced that it's better to use unbalanced scale than balanced scale. But again, that's an artificial effect of ARS and artificial effect of a response style on satisfaction with life. So implications so far, I tend to like the balanced scale, balanced satisfaction with life scale, which I believe has a really huge implications in how we measure and understand satisfaction with life around the world. We saw significant changes in response distributions once we use balanced scale, and we saw the satisfaction score getting lower, right? It just like went down, the slope went down quite a bit. That, when we focus on a person extremely satisfied alone, we saw once we use balanced scale that just went down quite a bit. And really, if you recall survey 2 with Hispanics interviewed in Spanish, under unbalanced scale, it was close to 60% of respondents classified as extremely satisfied. Like, who would believe that 60% of your population is extremely satisfied with life? That's, like, just face validity doesn't quite make sense. So that actually happened across all surveys and all racial, ethnic, linguistic groups, but not for Koreans interviewed in Korean. And if you remember, Koreans interviewed in Korean showed quite a bit of high middle response tendency, right? So no matter how you ask, they're gonna say neither, or maybe slightly. So it doesn't matter whether you balance or not, because the middle response is not subject to changes in this design. And also we saw changes in the ranking across different groups. And with the balanced scale, the logical relationship or expected relationship expected relationship with each correlates seem to hold in the logical way than using unbalanced scale. However, you may see a lower reliability. Oopsie. And this is just a tip of the iceberg. I should really dig in this a little more and look at the data in depth. So I will be doing kind of differentiating response style with a straight lining, because a lot of our 3 out of 4 surveys were web based. So it is entirely possible that people might have been straight lining rather than using particular response style. So I will be looking at that. And also, as Fernanda did, I will be doing some measurement models, like CFA without response style factors, as mentioned before. And CFA with a response factor can only be done with a balanced scale. And because we have a balanced scale, we are able to accommodate that part. And we hope to be able to compare these groups that we saw with various satisfaction with life scores other than the ones we saw, especially the latent scores that will come from these measurement models, and also with and without the style correction. And we looked at education and income as sort of a concurrent validity measures, and I hope to expand that a little bit so that we can see more of which balancing versus unbalancing, which would be more beneficial than others. And I believe that's it. So thank you for your attention today.
And thank you to all 3 of the speakers for extremely thought-provoking presentations. Thank you. We're out of time, unfortunately. So we don't have really room for question and answers, although Sunghee, Rachel, Fernanda, I mean, I think one or all of you are co-hosts, and so you could keep the conversation going if you want, but I know a number of us need to sign off for other purposes right now. So do you want to entertain questions from the chat while some of us log off? I think you should be able to do that. Oh, you're muted, Sunghee.
Yeah, sure. You can set me as a host and I should be able to carry on.
Yeah, I think you may be already, but yes. So why don't you go ahead and there's some questions in the chat probably. I know, Rachel, you had a question from about Spanish versus English and how that might affect ARS, and you answered that directly to the questioner, but you may want to answer that generally.
Sure, I think I sent it to everyone, but
okay.
Yeah, you do generally see higher ARS during Spanish language interviews. In our study, most people completely interview in Spanish, so we didn't see a difference. And I don't know the answer to the slide question.
Oh yeah, well, it's really up to the 3 of you. If you're willing to share your slides, we will post them.
Oh yeah.
Okay. Fred, I have a question.
Yeah, Stanley.
I'd be curious. First of all, I appreciated that. I was really intrigued to hear all these results, and they're very nicely done. And so I want to thank all of the speakers. I'm curious for each of you whether you might conclude, therefore, that we should no longer use agree-disagree items.
I mean, there's definitely debate of using item-specific response options rather than agreement response options, but I don't think there's a strong evidence showing that that is actually advantageous. And I think the findings have been just mixed thus far. And I don't know the extent of groups that have been considered in the discussion of item-specific response scales. I will also ask Rachel and Fernanda about that.
Yeah, I will say, at least in study 1, we did not see a difference from the agree-disagree scales to using more item-specific response scales. But I think the jury's out.
I would also add that a lot of inventories are actually written like that. So just people like take them and put them into their questionnaires. So I don't think they will be going away anytime soon.
Yeah, I agree that they're not going away anytime soon because they've been with us for so long. But from a methodological vantage point, why is the jury still out? It seems to me that most of your results suggest that at least some of the time, the greater reliability is just foolish, that we're getting greater reliability because it's just all method effects and it's interfering, it's noise. And so I guess I'm not sure, other than the heavy hand of the past, why should we continue?
Yeah, I wish I had a great solution to that. Again, item-specific response options. Again, we still don't have a clear evidence showing that it is more advantageous. So this was our attempt to show, like, what if we just balance a couple of items? Because that's much easier than coming up with item-specific responses, which actually can be quite difficult from the designing perspectives, and also how you come up with the scoring norms can also be tricky once we use item-specific response the scales. And I hope to see more from that so that we can be more informed.
Question from me. Just check my volume. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, I can see 8 key problems with agree, disagree. Citing the study by Rimsaris, where they use the multi-trait, multi-method, where the agree, disagree has less reliability and validity than an item specific.
Mm-hmm.
But it is possible to have a middle ground where you just keep the statements because it's much easier to keep your multi-item scale in the grid format, but use some other kind of answer category because it's so easy just to agree. But it could be something like, describes me completely to not at all, or true scale, or just something else. It's sort of a middle ground between the agree, disagree format and the item specific format.
I think that'd be really interesting to see, like, experimentally how that will help. And actually, I will be in the field with a Korean American sample soon. And there, intentionally, we created a response without the middle option.
Yes.
To see whether we can force people to choose something rather than neither. So we'll see.
Yeah. Great presentations, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, so if not, please feel free to contact any of us at any time. And we promise that we will make the slides available, hopefully with references added. And hopefully you'll find the slides helpful for your research. Thank you so much, everybody, joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you all.